Hi, Dr. Versalotti here, and in this screencast we're going to talk about emergentism. And this is a term for a group of theories interested in looking at language development in a new and different way. One such group within emergentism is usage-based language learning, and that has the premise of that we learn language from using it. So there's no competence versus performance that can't be separated. It's the same. And this group of theories has been termed maybe post-cognitive because although its roots are in a more cognitive approach to language learning, it is beyond just a cognitive information processing approach. So there are three important tenets of emergentism: associative learning, probabilistic learning, and rational contingency learning. Let's look at each individually. The first one, associative, meaning that the learning instances or exemplars are in the input. That's how we learn. We have a exemplar, a good example, a prototypical example. Often it's it's a common, frequent word that shapes our learning of the pattern. For instance, if there's there's a construction such as I gave him a book. So a learner might learn that construction, and like a verb like gave is very common. We can use it a lot. And then a learner of English might try, he suggested me an idea. Using that exemplar or that instance of being successful with I gave him a book, they might use that same pattern, substituting out the different words as needed to express meaning. Now, this is an example of overgeneralization of a pattern, but it's great evidence of what the learner knows about English. They know that English has this ditransitive verb construction, right? There's the noun phrase subject, a verb, and that ditransitive verb takes two objects, the indirect object and the direct object. And so they know that construction, and they try it to express meaning different from that exemplar. But they use that exemplar as like a template, as a pattern holder, cookie cutter like. And then with more input, with more practice, the learner may then be able to restrict that pattern to specific verbs. But you can see how that L1 and L2 learning, this happens to be an example from L2, but you could the same pattern would be possible in an L1 learning situation with child learning language. The second one is that learning is probabilistic. Often there might be criticisms of thinking that, our brains are not a computer. We can't remember exactly how many times we've seen a certain construction. We can't count the frequency, and we don't do that consciously. But in this theory, language learning is probabilistic in that it's not categorical. It's things that are more common and less common, more expected and less expected. And in the probabilistic, we don't just work on frequency, we also use guesses and inferences. We try to figure out what works in the language. And that brings us to the third one, rational contingency. We're going to use the best possible evidence as we're working on producing the language, understanding the language. We're going to use all the information available. So we're going to use overall statistics based on our experience of, how many times have I heard this word in this context versus that context. We're going to use also the most recent relevant evidence. And so if we've seen an example recently a lot, that's probably going to help us decide what to do. We're going to pay attention to cues that are present in the language. And we're also going to use context clues. We're going to use all the information that we have in the language, right? Remember, our learning emerges from the language input, which is the input in the environment, but also our own input. And this is a nice quote that development can be envisioned then as a series of evolving and dissolving patterns of varying dynamic stability. And language really is about the patterns. And when we study language learning, we look for those patterns in the learner's interlanguage to understand, to have a better understanding of their knowledge and skill of language learning, and how we can understand that interlanguage. We're going to look at the patterns.